The black SUV rolled through the iron gates of Pemberton Estate just as the morning fog began to lift from the ancient oak trees. Inside the vehicle, Deputy Director Vincent Hayes adjusted his tie for the third time in 10 minutes. He wasn't nervous, at least that's what he kept telling himself. This was supposed to be a simple diplomatic meeting, nothing more than signing papers and shaking hands for the cameras, but something felt off about this whole situation. The estate stretched out before them like something from a movie set. Massive. Stone walls covered in ivy, towers that reached toward the gray sky, and gardens that looked like they hadn't changed in 200 years. Hayes had seen plenty of government buildings in his career, but this place was different. It felt alive with history, every stone seeming to whisper stories from centuries past. As their car approached the main entrance, Hayes noticed something that made his jaw tighten. 5 figures stood perfectly still near the great wooden doors, dressed in elaborate uniforms that belonged in a museum rather than a modern diplomatic meeting. Red coats with golden buttons, tall black hats with white plumes, and ceremonial swords hanging at their sides. They looked like they had stepped straight out of the Revolutionary War. "What's with the costume party?" Hayes muttered to his driver. Agent Rodriguez, who had been unusually quiet during the entire drive, Rodriguez glanced in the rearview mirror. "The estate maintains certain traditions, sir. They call them the Royal Guard. It's part of their historical preservation program." Hayes rolled his eyes. Historical preservation was one thing, but this was ridiculous. He was here to discuss serious matters involving international trade agreements, not to play dress-up with weekend warriors who probably worked at the local Renaissance fair during their off hours. The SUV came to a stop in the circular driveway, and Hayes could see the guards more clearly now. They weren't moving, weren't even blinking as far as he could tell. Their faces were stern and focused, like they were actually protecting something important instead of just putting on a show for tourists. Agent Rodriguez stepped out first, scanning the area with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 15 years in government security. 3 more agents emerged from the second vehicle, each one professionally dressed and clearly uncomfortable with the medieval atmosphere surrounding them. Hayes finally stepped out of the car, immediately feeling underdressed, despite his expensive suit. The guards didn't acknowledge his presence, didn't even turn their heads in his direction. They just stood there like statues, staring straight ahead with an intensity that made Hayes wonder if they were taking this role-playing thing a bit too seriously. The estate manager, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Blackwood, appeared at the entrance with a warm smile and a slight bow. He was exactly what Hayes expected, old money written all over him, from his perfectly pressed vest to his polished shoes that probably cost more than most people's cars. "Deputy Director Hayes, welcome to Pemberton Estate," Blackwood said, extending his hand. "We're honored to host such an important meeting on our grounds." Hayes shook the man's hand, trying to ignore the way the guards seemed to be watching him from the corner of their eyes. "Thank you for accommodating us on such short notice, Mr. Blackwood, though I have to ask, is all this really necessary?" He gestured toward the uniformed figures. Blackwood's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in his eyes. "The Royal Guard is an integral part of our estate's character, sir. They've been protecting these grounds for over a century. We find that our guests rather enjoy the authentic historical atmosphere." Protecting these grounds from what? Hayes wondered. Tourists with cameras, schoolchildren on field trips? The whole thing seemed like an expensive waste of time and money. Agent Rodriguez stepped closer to Hayes, his voice low but professional. "Sir, we should probably head inside. The other parties will be arriving within the hour, and we haven't completed our security sweep of the building yet." Hayes nodded, but his attention was drawn back to the guards. The one in the center, apparently their leader based on the extra decorations on his uniform, had shifted his weight slightly. It was barely noticeable, but Hayes caught it. These weren't just actors going through the motions. There was something alert and watchful about them that reminded him more of actual soldiers than historical RENACTORS. As they walked toward the entrance, Hayes found himself studying the lead guard more carefully. The man was probably in his 50s, with gray touching his temples beneath the ceremonial hat. His posture was perfect, his eyes constantly moving despite his apparently fixed stare. There were small scars on his hands that spoke of real experience with weapons, not just parade ground drilling. "Mr. Blackwood," Hayes said as they reached the massive wooden doors, "exactly what kind of background do these guards have?" "They seem rather professional for actors." Blackwood paused with his hand on the ornate door handle. "Oh, they're quite dedicated to their roles, Deputy Director. We only hire the finest individuals for such important positions. Many have extensive experience in their previous careers. Hayes filed that information away for later consideration. He was starting to suspect that there was more to this Royal Guard situation than simple historical theater. The interior of the estate was even more impressive than the outside. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadows above, while portraits of long-dead aristocrats gazed down from oil paintings that belonged in world-class museums. Suits of armor stood in alcoves, and tapestries covered walls that were probably older than the country itself. Agent Rodriguez was already coordinating with the other security personnel, their modern equipment looking strangely out of place among the medieval decorations. Hayes watched them work, noting how efficiently they moved through their procedures despite the unusual setting, but his mind kept drifting back to those guards outside. Something about their presence bothered him beyond the simple annoyance of unnecessary pageantry. There was an alertness to them that suggested they were watching for real threats, not just maintaining an historical facade. As Mr. Blackwood led them through corridors lined with ancient weapons and historical artifacts, Hayes began to understand why someone might want extra security at a place like this. The estate was practically a museum filled with items that were probably worth millions of dollars. Maybe the Royal Guard wasn't as pointless as he had initially thought. Still, the whole situation felt excessive for what was supposed to be a routine diplomatic meeting. They were here to sign agreements about trade regulations, not to negotiate the fate of nations. The level of formality and security seemed way out of proportion to the actual importance of the event. Hayes was pulled from his thoughts as they entered what Blackwood called the stateroom, a massive chamber, with a conference table that could seat 20 people comfortably. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the estate's gardens, where he could see more uniformed figures patrolling the grounds. "How many of these guards do you actually employ?" Hayes asked, genuinely curious now. "As many as necessary," Blackwood replied diplomatically. "The estate has been in our family for generations, Deputy Director. We take our responsibilities very seriously." Responsibilities. Not traditions, not historical accuracy, responsibilities. Hayes was beginning to think. There was a lot more going on at Pemberton Estate than anyone was telling him. 20 minutes before the other diplomatic parties were scheduled to arrive, Deputy Director Hayes found himself pacing in front of the massive windows of the stateroom. The Royal Guard was still visible in the courtyard below, standing at their posts like they were guarding the crown jewels instead of overseeing a simple trade meeting. Agent Rodriguez entered the room with a tablet in his hand, his expression professional but slightly concerned. "Sir, we've completed our initial security sweep. The building is clear, but there are some unusual elements we need to discuss." Hayes turned from the window, already knowing this conversation wasn't going to improve his mood. "What kind of unusual elements?" "Well, for starters, this place has more hidden passages and secret rooms than any building I've ever secured. Mr. Blackwood showed us some of them, but I get the feeling there are more he didn't mention. The structural layout doesn't match the original blueprints we received." Hayes rubbed his temples. "Hidden passages. Of course there were hidden passages. What else?" "The estate's own security system is more sophisticated than we initially thought. They have cameras and sensors in places that most private residences wouldn't need." "And those guards outside?" Rodriguez paused, choosing his words carefully. "They're not actors, sir." "What do you mean they're not actors?" Rodriguez pulled up something on his tablet. "I ran a quick background check on the one who appears to be their leader. Captain Whitmore, that's what the other guards call him. Former Marine Corps served 3 tours overseas, decorated veteran. The others have similar backgrounds. These aren't weekend warriors playing dress-up. These are trained professionals. Hayes felt his irritation growing. So what are you telling me, Rodriguez? That this estate hired a bunch of ex-military to stand around in costumes and play pretend? I'm telling you that something doesn't add up, sir. Why would you need that level of real security for a historical preservation site? And why wouldn't they just tell us that up front? Before Hayes could respond, Mr. Blackwood knocked on the door and entered with his usual polite smile. Deputy Director, I wanted to inform you that the other parties have arrived slightly early. The delegates from the European Union are currently being escorted to the East Wing, and the Asian trade representatives should be here within the next few minutes. Hayes nodded, but his mind was still on the guards. Mr. Blackwood, I need to ask you something directly. Those men outside, they're not just historical reenactors, are they? Blackwood's smile faltered for just a moment. I'm not sure I understand what you mean, sir. I mean, they're actual security personnel with real military backgrounds, aren't they? So why the elaborate costumes? Why not just tell us we'd be working with your security team? The Royal Guard has been a tradition at this estate for many generations, Blackwood said carefully. Their methods may seem unconventional, but they've proven very effective over the years. Hayes exchanged a look with Rodriguez. That wasn't really an answer, and they all knew it. But before he could press the issue further, the sound of vehicles arriving in the courtyard drew his attention back to the window. 2 black sedans had pulled up near the main entrance, and Hayes could see the Royal Guard snapping to attention with military precision. Whatever else they were, these men definitely knew how to soldier. But as Hayes watched the new arrivals being escorted toward the building, his irritation reached a boiling point. The whole situation was becoming a circus. Here he was trying to conduct serious international business, and instead of focusing on trade agreements and economic policy, he was dealing with costumed guards and secret passages like he was in some kind of adventure movie. This is ridiculous, Hayes muttered, then turned to Rodriguez with decision clear in his voice. I want those guards removed from the premises, all of them. Rodriguez blinked in surprise. Sir, you heard me? This is supposed to be a professional, diplomatic meeting, not a Renaissance fair. Those men in their ridiculous costumes are going to be a distraction at best and an embarrassment at worst. Get them off the property. But sir, if they're actually providing security, we have our own security, Agent Rodriguez. We don't need a bunch of men playing dress-up to complicate an already delicate situation. Remove them now. Mr. Blackwood stepped forward, his composure finally showing cracks. Deputy Director Hayes, I really must protest. The Royal Guard is an integral part of our estate's operations. They cannot simply be dismissed. Hayes turned to face the estate manager fully, his patience finally exhausted. Mr. Blackwood, with all due respect, this is now a government function being held on your property. My security team has jurisdiction over this event, and I'm telling you that those guards need to go. They can come back and play their little historical games after we're finished here. The room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Blackwood looked like he wanted to argue further, but seemed to realize that pushing the issue would only make things worse. Rodriguez cleared his throat. Sir, should I speak with their captain directly, or would you prefer to handle this through Mr. Blackwood? Handle it directly, Hayes said firmly. Go outside and tell Captain Whitmore, or whatever he calls himself, that his services are no longer needed today. Be polite but clear. They need to leave the property immediately. As Rodriguez headed for the door, Hayes could see real distress on Blackwood's face. The older man was wringing his hands and looking like someone had just told him his house was on fire. Deputy Director, please reconsider, Blackwood said quietly. You don't understand the full situation here. What situation? It's a trade meeting, Mr. Blackwood. We sign some papers, shake some hands, maybe have lunch, and then everyone goes home. What could possibly require armed guards in 18th century uniforms? Blackwood opened his mouth as if to explain, then seemed to think better of it. Perhaps you're right, sir. Perhaps the situation isn't as complex as we sometimes make it out to be. But Hayes wasn't buying the sudden change in attitude. If anything, Blackwood's reluctant agreement made him more suspicious. What was the old man not telling him? Through the window, Hayes could see Rodriguez approaching the Royal Guard. The agent looked uncomfortable with his assignment, but he was following orders like the professional he was. Hayes watched as Rodriguez spoke to Captain Whitmore, noting how the guard's posture remained perfectly military despite whatever was being said to him. The other guards had turned slightly to listen to the conversation, and Hayes could see tension building in their formation. Whatever Rodriguez was telling them, they clearly didn't like it. Captain Whitmore said something in response to Rodriguez, his expression remaining neutral but his body language suggesting disagreement. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Rodriguez gesturing toward the building and Whitmore occasionally shaking his head. Finally, Rodriguez turned and began walking back toward the estate, leaving the Royal Guard standing in their original positions. Hayes frowned. They should have been packing up and leaving by now. When Rodriguez returned to the stateroom, his expression was troubled. "Sir, we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "Captain Whitmore says he can't comply with the dismissal order. He says he has responsibilities that supersede our authority." Hayes felt his blood pressure rising. Responsibilities? To whom? He wouldn't say, sir. Just that removing his men from their posts wasn't an option today. Blackwood had gone very pale during this exchange, and Hayes noticed the older man's hands were actually shaking slightly. "Mr. Blackwood," Hayes said slowly, "exactly what is going on here? And this time I want the truth." The silence in the stateroom stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Mr. Blackwood's face had gone from pale to nearly white, and his hands were trembling as he gripped the back of an antique chair. Deputy Director Hayes stared at him, waiting for an answer that seemed to be stuck somewhere between the old man's brain and his mouth. "Agent." Rodriguez broke the tension by clearing his throat. "Sir, the other diplomatic parties are waiting in the East Wing. Should I tell them we're running behind schedule?" Hayes didn't take his eyes off Blackwood. "Give us 5 more minutes, then bring them here whether we're ready or not." As Rodriguez left the room, Hayes moved closer to the estate manager. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm going to ask you one more time. What aren't you telling me about those guards? And don't give me another speech about historical traditions." Blackwood seemed to age 10 years in the span of a few seconds. He walked to the window and stared down at the courtyard where the Royal Guard still stood at their posts, completely unmoved by the dismissal order. "Some responsibilities go deeper than employment contracts, Deputy Director," Blackwood said quietly. "Some duties are passed down through generations." Hayes felt his patience snap completely. "That's it." Rodriguez was too polite. "I'm going down there myself to deal with this situation." He stormed toward the door, but Blackwood's voice stopped him. "Deputy Director, please. You don't understand what you're interfering with. Then explain it to me. In plain English, without all the mysterious double talk." Blackwood looked like a man caught between a rock and a hard place. "There are things about this estate that ... that aren't widely known. The Royal Guard isn't just for show. They protect something that's been hidden here for over 2 centuries. Hayes turned around slowly. "Hidden? What kind of hidden?" "Documents, artifacts, items that were placed here for safekeeping during times of political upheaval. Items that certain people would do anything to get their hands on." "What kind of people?" Before Blackwood could answer, Hayes heard shouting from outside. He rushed to the window and saw Agent Rodriguez back in the courtyard, this time with 2 other security agents flanking him. The agent was gesturing more forcefully now, clearly trying to assert government authority over the situation. Captain Whitmore stood perfectly still, listening to whatever Rodriguez was saying. The other Royal Guards had moved slightly closer to their captain, forming a loose semicircle that looked casual but was clearly defensive. Hayes could see the tension building like storm clouds. Then it happened. As Rodriguez finished speaking and took a step backward, expecting the guards to finally comply with the dismissal order, Captain Whitmore did something unexpected. Instead of stepping back or moving to gather his men, he took one deliberate step forward. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't threatening. but it was unmistakably defiant. The other guards immediately followed suit, each taking a single step forward in perfect unison. They weren't advancing on Rodriguez and his men, but they were making a statement that was impossible to misinterpret. They weren't leaving. Hayes watched Rodriguez's body language change instantly. The agent's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket, where Hayes knew he kept his service weapon. The other two agents spread out slightly, creating a tactical formation that they'd been trained to use in potentially hostile situations. "This is escalating fast," Hayes muttered, then turned to Blackwood. "Call them off right now, before this turns into something none of us want to deal with." Blackwood shook his head sadly. "I don't have that authority, Deputy Director. The Royal Guard doesn't answer to me." "Then who do they answer to? To their oath, to their duty, to something bigger than any of us?" Hayes was about to demand a clearer explanation when he noticed movement in the courtyard. Captain Whitmore was saying something to Rodriguez, and whatever it was seemed to be having an effect. The government agent's posture relaxed slightly, and his hand moved away from his weapon, but the standoff was far from over. The Royal Guard remained in their forward position, and Rodriguez was clearly at a loss for how to handle the situation. He'd been given a direct order by a high-ranking government official, but he was facing people who seemed equally determined. To ignore that order, Hayes pulled out his phone and dialed Rodriguez's number. Through the window, he could see the agent answer his call. "Rodriguez, what's happening down there?" "Sir, this is unusual. Captain Whitmore says he's willing to explain the situation, but only if you come down here personally. He says there are things you need to understand before making any final decisions about dismissing his team." Hayes felt a mix of anger and curiosity. "What kind of things?" "He won't say over the radio, sir. But he seems to think that once you know what they're actually protecting here, you might see the situation differently." Hayes looked at Blackwood, who was nodding encouragingly. "It might be for the best, Deputy Director. There are things that are easier to show than to explain." Against his better judgment, Hayes found himself intrigued. The whole situation had gone so far beyond normal diplomatic protocol that his curiosity was starting to outweigh his frustration. "Fine," Hayes said into the phone. "But Rodriguez, I want our other agents positioned strategically around the courtyard. If this is some kind of trap or game, I want us ready to handle it." "Already on it, sir." Hayes ended the call and headed for the door, but Blackwood caught his arm gently. "Deputy Director, before you go down there, you should know that what you're about to learn will change how you see this entire meeting. The trade agreements you came here to sign. They're important, but they're not the most important thing. Happening at this estate today," Hayes stared at the old man. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that sometimes history chooses its own timing, and sometimes the past and present collide in ways that nobody can predict or control." Hayes shook off Blackwood's hand and headed for the door. He'd had enough of cryptic warnings and mysterious hints. If these guards wanted to explain themselves, they could do it in plain English with no more games. As he walked through the corridors of the estate, Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something much bigger than a simple disagreement about security protocols. The portraits on the walls seemed to be watching him, and the ancient weapons displayed in glass cases suddenly looked less like museum pieces and more like reminders of times when people settled their differences with steel instead of words. The main entrance of the estate opened before him, and Hayes stepped into the courtyard where the standoff was taking place. Up close, the Royal Guard looked even more professional and determined than they had from the window. These weren't men playing dress-up games. These were soldiers, and they were treating this situation like a military operation. Captain Whitmore turned as Hayes approached, and the Deputy Director was struck by the intensity in the man's eyes. This wasn't the look of someone following orders because he was paid to do so. This was the look of someone who believed deeply in what he was doing. "Deputy Director Hayes," Whitmore said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone used to command. "Thank you for coming down here. I believe there are some things you need to see before you make any decisions about our presence here today." Hayes looked around at the assembled men, his own security team on one side, the Royal Guard on the other, and himself caught in the middle of something he still didn't fully understand. Captain Whitmore, I'm going to be very clear with you. I don't care what you think you're protecting here. This is a government function, and my authority supersedes whatever arrangement you have with Mr. Blackwood. Whitmore nodded respectfully. I understand your position, sir. But I think once you see what we're actually guarding, you'll realize that some things are more important than protocol. Hayes felt like he was standing at a crossroads with no clear understanding of which path would lead where. All he knew was that the simple diplomatic meeting he'd planned was turning into something that felt far more significant and dangerous than anything he'd prepared for. The tension in the courtyard was thick enough to cut with a knife. Deputy Director Hayes stood between his security team and the Royal Guard, feeling like he was in the middle of a standoff that could go wrong in a dozen different ways. Captain. Whitmore's words hung in the air between them. Some things are more important than protocol. Before Hayes could respond, Agent Rodriguez stepped closer and lowered his voice. Sir, while you were inside, I had one of our junior agents do some discreet checking around the estate. You might want to hear what he found. Hayes nodded, keeping his eyes on Whitmore. Go ahead. Agent Parker spoke with some of the maintenance staff. Apparently there have been some unusual incidents around here lately. People nosing around the property at night, asking questions in town about the estate's history. The local police have had to increase their patrols in this area over the past few weeks. That got Hayes's attention. What kind of incidents? Rodriguez glanced at the Royal Guard, then back at Hayes. Break-in attempts 3 different times in the last month. Nothing was taken, but someone has definitely been trying to get inside this place. The interesting part is that each time the intruders seemed to know exactly where they were going. They weren't random burglars looking for valuables. Hayes felt the first stirring of real concern. They were looking for something specific? That's what it looks like, sir. And according to the staff, the Royal Guard has been working extra shifts ever since the first attempt. They're not just here for show during your meeting, they've been here around the clock. Captain Whitmore had been listening to this exchange with a carefully neutral expression, but Hayes caught a flicker of something in the man's eyes. Relief, maybe. Like he was glad the truth was finally starting to come out. Captain, Hayes said, turning to face Whitmore directly. Is there something you'd like to add to what Agent Rodriguez just told me? Whitmore exchanged a quick look with his men, then seemed to come to a decision. Deputy Director, there are things happening around this estate that go beyond what Mr. Blackwood has told you. Things that could affect national security if they fall into the wrong hands. What kind of things? Before Whitmore could answer, one of the estate's gardeners came hurrying around the corner of the building. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with dirt under his fingernails and worry written all over his face. Captain Whitmore, sir, the gardener called out, slightly out of breath. You need to know, I found fresh footprints near the old oak tree. Someone was there during the night, and they left behind some kind of electronic equipment. The effect of this news on the Royal Guard was immediate. All 5 men shifted into a higher state of alertness, their casual stance transforming into something much more military. Hayes realized that whatever was going on here, these men were taking it very seriously indeed. Agent Rodriguez was already pulling out his radio. I'll have our technical team sweep the area? No, Whitmore said firmly. With respect, Agent Rodriguez, your team doesn't know what to look for. This isn't standard surveillance equipment. Whoever is interested in this place has access to some very sophisticated technology. Hayes felt like he was trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Captain Whitmore, I'm going to ask you directly. What exactly are you people protecting here? Whitmore looked at the other guards, then at Mr. Blackwood, who had appeared in the doorway of the estate. The old man gave a barely perceptible nod. Deputy Director, Whitmore said carefully, this estate has been home to more than just the Blackwood family for the past 2 centuries. During the Revolutionary War, certain documents and artifacts were hidden here for safekeeping. Documents that were never retrieved because the people who hid them didn't survive the war. Hayes felt his pulse quicken. What kind of documents? The kind that could rewrite American history if they were authenticated. Maps showing the locations of other hidden treasures, correspondence between founding fathers that was never meant to be public, and financial records that could prove or disprove some very important claims about how this country was actually founded. Agent Rodriguez whistled softly. That would definitely explain why someone might want to break in here. It gets worse, Whitmore continued. 3 weeks ago, we intercepted communications suggesting that a group of international collectors has discovered the existence of these documents. They're not interested in American history. They're interested in selling these items to the highest bidder, regardless of what that might mean for this country's heritage. Hayes looked around the courtyard, suddenly seeing everything in a different light. The elaborate security, the professional guards, the hidden passages that Rodriguez had mentioned, it all made sense now. And you think these collectors might try something during today's meeting? We think they've been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, Whitmore said grimly. A high-profile government function with multiple security teams from different agencies, the kind of confusion that could provide cover for a well-planned operation. As if summoned by their conversation, Agent Parker came jogging around the corner of the estate, his radio crackling with static. He was breathing hard and looked distinctly worried. "Agent Rodriguez, sir," Parker called out. "We've got a problem. I was doing a perimeter check like you asked, and I found 3 vehicles parked about half a mile down the road. They're not local rental cars with out-of-state plates. But here's the thing, they're empty, and they look like they've been there for hours." Hayes felt his stomach drop. "Empty vehicles?" "Yes, sir." Which means whoever was driving them is probably already on foot somewhere in this area. The Royal Guard moved closer together, forming a protective circle that put Hayes and his agents in the center. It was a smooth, practiced movement that spoke of extensive training and coordination. How many people could those vehicles hold? Whitmore asked. "At least 12, sir." "Maybe more if they were packed tight." Hayes looked at Rodriguez. "How many security personnel do we have on site?" 8, including myself and you, sir. Plus the Royal Guard makes 13 total. Whitmore shook his head. "Actually, Deputy Director, there are more of us than you've seen. We've had additional security positioned around the estate since the first break-in attempt. But even so, if we're dealing with a dozen or more hostile individuals who've had time to scout the area and plan their approach, we're going to need to coordinate very carefully." Hayes felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. What had started as a simple diplomatic meeting was turning into something that sounded like a military operation. "Captain, what exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that we work together to protect both the diplomatic function you came here to conduct and the historical artifacts that have been hidden here for over 2 centuries. But first, I think you need to see what we're actually guarding. You need to understand what's at stake here." Hayes looked back at the estate, then at the faces of the men around him. Both his security team and the Royal Guard were waiting for his decision, and he realized that whatever choice he made in the next few minutes would determine how the rest of this day played out. "Show me," Hayes said finally. "But first, I want every available person we have establishing a secure perimeter around this property. If there really are hostile individuals in the area, I want to know about them before they get close enough to cause trouble." Whitmore nodded with obvious approval. "Understood, sir, and Deputy Director, thank you for listening. You're about to see something that very few people have ever seen." The sound that changed everything was barely audible at first, a soft beeping that seemed to come from somewhere in the estate's ancient walls. Captain Whitmore's head snapped up immediately, his expression shifting from cautious cooperation to full alert. "That's the motion sensor for the north wall," he said quietly, his hand moving instinctively to the radio clipped to his belt. "We have movement in Sector 3. Deputy Director Hayes felt his blood run cold. "How many people?" Before Whitmore could answer, Agent Rodriguez's radio crackled to life with urgent chatter. "All units, we have visual confirmation of at least 6 individuals approaching from the wooded area. They're moving in coordinated formation and appear to be armed." Hayes looked around the courtyard, suddenly realizing how exposed they all were standing in the open space. The diplomatic meeting that had seemed so important an hour ago now felt like a dangerous distraction from something much more serious. "Captain," Hayes said, his voice taking on the authority that had carried him through 15 years of government service, "I'm officially requesting your assistance in securing this location. Whatever our disagreements were about protocol, they're over now." Whitmore nodded grimly. "Understood, sir. But first, we need to get you and the other diplomatic parties to safety. The estate has secure areas that were designed for exactly this kind of situation." Agent Parker came running across the courtyard, his face flushed and his breathing heavy. "Sir, we've got bigger problems than we thought. Those empty vehicles down the road? We found 2 more hidden in the woods. We're looking at potentially 20 hostile individuals, and they've been planning this for a while." Hayes felt his heart rate spike. 20 armed intruders against 13 defenders. And 3 of those defenders were foreign diplomats who weren't trained for combat situations. The math wasn't good. "What kind of weapons are we talking about?" Rodriguez asked, already checking his own sidearm. "Professional grade, sir. We found evidence of surveillance equipment that's been monitoring the estate for at least a week. These aren't random thieves. This is a coordinated operation by people who know what they're doing." Captain Whitmore was speaking rapidly into his radio, coordinating with the other Royal Guard members who were positioned around the estate. Hayes caught fragments of the conversation, something about fallback positions and emergency protocols. That had clearly been planned long before today's meeting. "Deputy Director," Whitmore said, ending his radio call, "we need to move everyone inside immediately. The estate has a safe room in the basement that can hold all the diplomatic parties while we deal with this situation." Hayes was about to respond when the unmistakable sound of breaking glass came from somewhere inside the building. The beeping from the motion sensors suddenly became a constant alarm, and Hayes realized that while they'd been talking in the courtyard, the real attack had already begun. "They're inside," Rodriguez said, drawing his weapon. "How is that possible? We secured all the entrances." "The same way they've been getting in for the past month," Whitmore replied, also drawing his sidearm, which, Hayes noted, was definitely not a ceremonial weapon. "They know about passages that aren't on any modern blueprints." Agent Parker was coordinating the other security personnel through his radio, but Hayes could tell from his expression that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The advantage of preparation and superior numbers was clearly with the intruders. "How well do you know the layout of this place?" Hayes asked Whitmore. "Better than anyone alive, sir. My family has been serving as guards here for 4 generations. I grew up exploring every hidden corner of this estate." Another crash came from inside the building, followed by what sounded like furniture being overturned. Hayes realized that the diplomatic parties who had arrived earlier were still somewhere in the East Wing, probably having no idea that their lives were in danger. "We need to reach the other diplomats," Hayes said. "They don't know what's happening," Whitmore shook his head. "Sir, with respect, we need to assume that the intruders know exactly where everyone is located. They've been watching this place for weeks. They know about today's meeting, and they're probably counting on using the diplomatic parties as leverage to get what they came for." The implications of that statement hit Hayes like a physical blow. "You think they're planning to take hostages?" "I think they're planning to take whatever they need to complete their mission. And if that includes holding government officials until they get access to the hidden artifacts, then yes, that's exactly what they're planning." Agent Rodriguez was speaking urgently into his radio, trying to coordinate with local law enforcement. But Hayes knew that even if backup was on the way, it would take at least 20 minutes for any significant help to arrive. 20 minutes was a lifetime in a situation like this. "Captain, what's your assessment of our tactical situation?" Whitmore's expression was grim but determined. "Honestly, sir, we're outnumbered and outgunned by people who've had weeks to plan their attack. But we have 2 advantages they don't know about." "Which are?" "First, they think the Royal Guard is just for show. They're expecting to deal with your security team and maybe a few rent-a-cops in funny costumes. They don't know they're going up against trained military personnel." Hayes nodded. "And the second advantage?" The artifacts they're looking for aren't where they think they are. The location has been changed 3 times in the past century, and the current hiding place is known only to myself and Mr. Blackwood. Even if they take control of the entire estate, they still won't be able to find what they came for. That was encouraging, but Hayes was more concerned about the immediate safety of everyone on the property. How many people are we talking about protecting? Agent Parker answered while reloading his weapon. 12 diplomatic personnel, plus our 8-person security team, plus however many Royal Guard you have positioned around the estate. 14 Royal Guard total, Whitmore said. But that includes men who are currently engaged with intruders. In other parts of the building, the sound of gunfire suddenly echoed from somewhere inside the estate, followed by shouting in what Hayes thought might be a foreign language. The situation had just escalated from a break-in to an active firefight. That's it, Hayes said, making a command decision. Captain Whitmore, I'm placing you in tactical command of this situation. Your people know this place better than anyone, and right now that's our most important asset. Whitmore nodded with obvious relief. Thank you, sir. Agent Rodriguez, I need your team to coordinate with my people. We're going to execute a fighting withdrawal to the secure areas of the estate while keeping the diplomatic parties safe. Rodriguez looked skeptical. Fighting withdrawal? Shouldn't we be calling for backup and holding our position? Agent Rodriguez, Whitmore said patiently, this estate has been successfully defended against hostile forces multiple times over the past 2 centuries. The people who built this place knew something about warfare, and they designed it to be defended by a small force against a larger one, but only if we use the defensive features properly. More gunfire erupted from inside the building, closer. This time, Hayes could hear the sound of heavy boots moving through the corridors, and he realized that the intruders were probably searching, room by room, for both the diplomatic parties and whatever artifacts they'd come to steal. How long can we hold out? Hayes asked. As long as we need to, sir, Whitmore replied. But first, we need to get everyone to safety and figure out exactly what we're dealing with. Agent Parker suddenly held up his hand for silence. In the distance, Hayes could hear the sound of vehicles approaching at high speed. For a moment, his heart lifted. Maybe backup was arriving sooner than expected, but Whitmore's expression darkened. Those aren't police sirens, he said quietly, and backup shouldn't be coming from that direction. Hayes felt his stomach drop as he realized what that meant. The intruders hadn't committed their entire force to the initial assault. They had reinforcements coming, and the odds against the defenders had just gotten much, much worse. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, and Deputy Director Hayes could see dust clouds rising from the estate's main road. Whatever was coming their way wasn't trying to be subtle about it. Captain Whitmore was already barking orders. Into his radio, coordinating defensive positions with his scattered team. Agent Rodriguez, Hayes called out, get on the horn with local law enforcement. I want every available unit heading this way, and I want them to know they're walking into an active combat situation. Rodriguez nodded and stepped away to make the call, but Hayes could see the doubt in his expression. Even if every police officer in the county was heading their way, it would still be at least 15 minutes before any real help arrived. Sir, Agent Parker interrupted, jogging back from the estate's main entrance, we've got movement inside the building. The diplomatic parties from the East Wing are being escorted down the main corridor by unknown individuals. They don't appear to be injured, but they're definitely not moving voluntarily. Hayes felt his blood pressure spike. Hostages? That's what it looks like, sir. Captain Whitmore finished his radio conversation and turned to Hayes with a grim expression. Deputy Director, we have a tactical situation developing. My men inside report that the intruders have split into 3 groups. One is moving the diplomatic parties toward the main hall. Another is searching the upper floors for the artifacts. And the third is setting up defensive positions to hold the building against any outside interference. Hayes ran his hand through his hair, trying to process the rapidly changing situation. How many of your people are still inside? 4 Royal Guard members, but they're outnumbered and have to be careful not to endanger the hostages. The intruders know exactly what they're doing? The sound of engines was getting closer now, and Hayes could make out at least 3 vehicles approaching fast. Agent Rodriguez finished his call and came back with news that wasn't encouraging. Local police are 20 minutes out, sir. State police are 45 minutes. FBI tactical team is at least an hour away. An hour? Hayes shook his head in frustration. In an hour, these people could be halfway to Mexico with both the hostages and whatever they came here to steal. Whitmore was studying the approaching dust clouds with a pair of binoculars. Actually, sir, I don't think they're planning to leave anytime soon. Those vehicles aren't transport trucks. They look like more personnel carriers. These people are here to stay until they get what they came for. Hayes felt a chill run down his spine. What exactly does that mean? It means they're not just planning a quick grab-and-run operation. They're planning to turn this estate into a fortress until they locate the hidden artifacts. And they're probably counting on using the diplomatic hostages as insurance against any aggressive response. Agent Parker was monitoring the radio chatter from inside the estate, his expression growing more concerned by the minute. Sir, we're getting reports that the intruders are setting up some kind of electronic equipment in the main hall. It looks like they're preparing for an extended siege. The first of the approaching vehicles came into view around the bend in the estate's driveway, a black SUV with tinted windows that screamed professional operation. It was followed by 2 more identical vehicles, all moving with the kind of coordination that spoke of military-style planning. How many people can those vehicles hold? Hayes asked. Probably 6 to 8 per vehicle, Whitmore replied. So we're looking at another 20-plus hostiles joining the ones already inside. Hayes did the math quickly in his head. With the reinforcements, they'd be facing at least 40 armed intruders. Even with the Royal Guard's knowledge of the estate's layout, those were overwhelming odds. Captain, I need your honest assessment. Can we hold this position? Whitmore lowered his binoculars and looked Hayes directly in the eye. Sir, with all due respect, holding this position isn't our primary objective anymore. Our primary objective is keeping those diplomatic hostages alive and preventing a priceless piece of American history from being stolen by international criminals. So, what do you suggest? I suggest we stop thinking like we're defending a building and start thinking like we're conducting a rescue operation. We need to get inside, extract the hostages, and protect the artifacts. And we need to do it before those reinforcements have time to establish complete control. Agent Rodriguez had been listening to the radio traffic from the local police, and he rejoined the group with an update. Sir, I've been coordinating with the incoming law enforcement units. They're setting up a perimeter 2 miles out and waiting for the FBI tactical team to arrive before they make any moves. Hayes felt his frustration boiling over. 2 miles out? What good does that do us? Standard protocol for hostage situations, sir. They don't want to escalate the situation until they have overwhelming force available. But by the time they have overwhelming force available, the situation will be over one way or another, Whitmore said grimly. These aren't amateur criminals who are going to panic and make mistakes. They're professionals, and they've clearly been planning this operation for a long time. The 3 SUVs had reached the estate's main courtyard and were disgorging personnel with military efficiency. Hayes counted at least 20 additional intruders, all armed with assault rifles and moving with the kind of coordination that suggested extensive training. Agent Parker, Hayes called out. What's the latest from inside the building? Not good, sir. The diplomatic parties have been moved to the main hall and are being held under guard. The search teams are working their way through the upper floors systematically, and they seem to know exactly where to look. Whitmore cursed under his breath. They've got inside information. Someone has told them about the estate's layout and the general area where the artifacts are hidden. Hayes felt a cold realization wash over him. Mr. Blackwood, where is he? They all looked around, suddenly realizing that the estate manager hadn't been seen since the situation began to deteriorate. Agent Rodriguez immediately got on his radio to check with the other security personnel. No one has visual on Blackwood, sir. He was last seen in the main building about 20 minutes ago, Before or after the intruders made entry? Before, sir. Whitmore's expression darkened. If they've got Blackwood, they've got access to information that could lead them directly to the artifacts. He knows the current hiding location. Hayes felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders. The situation was spiraling out of control, and every minute they spent discussing options was another minute for the intruders to solidify their position and extract information from their hostages. Captain, I'm making an executive decision. We're not waiting for backup. We're going in now while we still have some element of surprise. Rodriguez looked shocked. Sir, with respect, that's not standard protocol for a hostage situation. Agent. Rodriguez, nothing about this situation is standard. We have foreign nationals holding American government officials hostage, while attempting to steal artifacts of national historical significance. Sometimes you have to throw the rulebook out the window. Whitmore nodded with obvious approval. What do you need from us, sir? I need you to get us inside that building without being detected. I need your knowledge of the hidden passages and defensive positions. And I need your people to coordinate with mine so we can execute a rescue operation that doesn't get anyone killed. Understood, sir? But there's something you need to know before we go in there. What? The artifacts they're looking for aren't just historically valuable? According to the documents that have been passed down through my family, some of those hidden items contain information that could be used to challenge the legitimacy of certain land claims and financial arrangements that are still legally binding. Today, Hayes stared at Whitmore. Are you telling me that this isn't just about stealing museum pieces? I'm telling you that this could be about billions of dollars in modern legal disputes. And if these artifacts fall into the wrong hands, it could affect a lot more than just American history. The sound of gunfire from inside the estate interrupted their conversation, followed by shouting and what sounded like furniture being overturned. The situation inside was clearly deteriorating, and Hayes realized they were running out of time to act. That's it, Hayes said firmly. We're going in. Captain, show us the way. Captain Whitmore led Deputy Director Hayes and Agent Rodriguez toward what looked like a solid stone wall at the rear of the estate. To Hayes, it seemed like they were walking straight into a dead end, but Whitmore moved with the confidence of someone who had walked this path 1,000 times before. There's a hidden entrance here that was built during the Civil War, Whitmore explained in a low voice, running his hands along the seemingly smooth stone surface. The original builders knew that someday someone might need to get in or out of this place without being seen. Hayes watched in amazement as Whitmore pressed a sequence of stones in what appeared to be a random pattern. With a soft grinding sound, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage that disappeared into darkness. "How many people know about this entrance?" Agent Rodriguez whispered. "In the modern era?" "Just myself, Mr. Blackwood, and maybe 2 or 3 of the senior Royal Guard members. But if Blackwood has been compromised..." Whitmore's voice trailed off, the implication clear. They slipped into the passage one by one, with Whitmore leading the way using a small flashlight. That cast just enough light to avoid complete darkness. The walls were roughly hewn stone, and Hayes could feel the weight of centuries pressing down around them. This wasn't just a hidden passage, it was a piece of living history. "The passage connects to the main basement area," Whitmore whispered, as they moved through the narrow space. "From there, we can access the service corridors that run throughout the estate. The intruders will be focused on the main floors and won't expect us to come up from below." Agent Parker's voice crackled through their radio earpieces. "All units, be advised. The hostages have been moved from the main hall to what appears to be the library on the second floor. We count 6 guards watching them, and they've set up defensive positions at both entrances to that area." Hayes felt his heart sink. The library was one of the most defensible rooms in the estate, with thick walls and limited access points. If the intruders had chosen that location deliberately, it meant they knew exactly what they were doing. "Captain," Hayes whispered, "how..." "Well, do you know the area around the library?" "Very well, sir. But there's something you need to know about that room. It's not just where they're holding the hostages, it's also directly above one of the possible locations for the hidden artifacts. Rodriguez stopped moving. You think they chose that location on purpose? I think they're using the hostages as human shields while they search for the artifacts below. It's tactically brilliant. We can't make any aggressive moves without endangering the diplomatic parties. They emerged from the passage into a basement area that looked like it belonged in a medieval castle. Stone arches supported a vaulted ceiling, and Hayes could see corridors branching off in multiple directions. The air was cool and smelled of age and secrets. Whitmore's radio crackled with a message from one of his men inside the estate. Captain, we have movement on the third floor. The search teams are working their way through the private quarters and they're using some kind of electronic detection equipment. Detection equipment? Hayes asked. Metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, maybe even thermal imaging to look for hidden spaces behind walls. These people have come prepared for a comprehensive search. Agent Rodriguez was monitoring the radio traffic from their backup units. Sir, I'm getting reports that the intruders have set up roadblocks on the main access roads. They're not just planning to hold the estate, they're planning to control all movement in and out of the area. Hayes realized that the situation had evolved far beyond a simple break-in. This was beginning to look like a military occupation of the entire area around the estate. How many ways in and out of this place are there? Hayes asked Whitmore. For vehicles, only 2 main roads. But for people on foot who know the terrain, there are dozens of paths through the woods. The problem is that most of those paths would take hours to traverse, and we don't have hours. A new voice came through their radio, Agent Turner, who had been positioned at the estate's main gate. All units, we have a problem. The intruders just brought in what looks like a mobile communications unit. They're setting up a sophisticated command center in the courtyard. Hayes felt his stomach drop. A mobile command center meant this operation was even larger and more organized than they had realized. These weren't just thieves looking to make a quick score. This was a full-scale military-style operation. Captain, what's your assessment of our chances if we try a direct assault on the library? Whitmore was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing their options. Honestly, sir? In a direct assault, we'd probably lose half the hostages and most of our own people. The intruders have had time to set up defensive positions, they have superior numbers, and they're holding the high ground. So what do you suggest? I suggest we use the same tactics that have protected this estate for over 2 centuries. We don't fight them where they're strong, we fight them where they're weak. Rodriguez looked confused. What does that mean? Whitmore pulled out a hand-drawn map of the estate's floor plan. The intruders are focused on the main floors because that's where they expect to find the artifacts. But there are areas of this estate that aren't on any official blueprints, spaces that were designed to be hidden even from people who thought they knew all the secrets. Hayes studied the map, noting several areas marked with symbols that he didn't recognize. Are you telling me there are hiding places that even Mr. Blackwood doesn't know about? I'm telling you that the people who built this place were very careful about compartmentalizing information. Different families knew different secrets, and some of those secrets were never written down anywhere. Agent Parker's voice came through. Their radios again, this time with more urgency. All units, the search teams have found something on the 3rd floor. They're bringing in additional equipment and calling in what sounds like their senior people. Whitmore cursed under his breath. They found one of the false hiding places. The original builders were smart enough to create decoys, spaces that look like they might contain hidden artifacts but actually don't. Will that buy us time? Maybe, but not much. Once they realize they've been tricked, they'll start looking for the real hiding places. And with their electronic equipment, they might actually find them. Hayes made a decision. Captain, I want you to show me the real hiding place. If these artifacts are as important as you say they are, I need to see them for myself. Whitmore hesitated. Sir, with respect, that information has been kept secret for over 2 centuries. Are you sure you want to take responsibility for that knowledge? Captain, I'm already responsible for the safety of 12 diplomatic hostages. and the security of whatever these people are trying to steal. I think I can handle one more responsibility. Whitmore nodded and led them deeper into the basement, through corridors that seemed to twist and turn without any logical pattern. Hayes realized that the estate's basement was like a maze, designed to confuse anyone who didn't know exactly where they were going. The real hiding place isn't just a room, Whitmore explained as they walked. It's an entire underground complex that was built in stages over several decades. The artifacts are stored in climate-controlled chambers that were carved directly into the bedrock beneath the estate. They stopped in front of what looked like a blank stone wall, but Hayes could see that this wall was different from the others. The stones were fitted together with almost mathematical precision, and there were subtle markings carved into some of the blocks. "Sir," Rodriguez interrupted, his voice tight with concern, "we're getting reports that the intruders are starting to get aggressive with the hostages. They're demanding that someone provide them with information about the artifact's location." Hayes felt the weight of command pressing down on him. Every minute they spent underground was another minute that innocent people were in danger above them. "Captain, show me what we're protecting. Then we're going back up there to end this situation once and for all." Whitmore pressed a complex sequence of stones, and Hayes heard the sound of ancient mechanisms moving behind the wall. Slowly, a section of the stone barrier slid aside, revealing a passage that glowed with soft artificial light. "Welcome to the real treasure chamber of Pemberton Estate," Whitmore said quietly. "What you're about to see has been hidden from the world for over 200 years. The treasure chamber took Deputy Director Hayes's breath away. What he had expected to be a dusty storage room was actually a sophisticated underground complex with temperature controls, humidity sensors, and security systems that looked like they belonged in a modern museum. Glass display cases lined the walls, each one containing documents and artifacts that seemed to glow under the carefully positioned lighting. "This is incredible," Hayes whispered, moving closer to examine what appeared to be handwritten letters, bearing familiar signatures from America's founding fathers. "How long has all this been down here?" Captain Whitmore's voice was filled with quiet pride. "Some of these items have been here since 1781. Others were added during the Civil War. And a few came here during World War II when certain European collections needed safe hiding places." Agent Rodriguez was studying a display case that contained what looked like original survey maps. "Are these what I think they are?" "Maps showing the original boundaries of land grants made by the Continental Congress," Whitmore confirmed. "Maps that could prove or disprove ownership claims worth billions of dollars in today's money." Hayes understood now why the intruders had been so determined and well organized. This wasn't just about historical artifacts. This was about documents that could reshape modern property rights and financial claims across multiple states. But their moment of amazement was interrupted by urgent radio chatter from Agent Parker. "All units, situation critical. The hostiles are threatening to execute one of the diplomatic hostages if they don't get cooperation in the next 10 minutes. Hayes felt his stomach drop. "Which hostage?" "The EU trade representative, sir. They're saying they'll start with him and work their way through the rest if someone doesn't provide them with information about the artifact's location." Whitmore was already moving toward the chamber's exit. "Sir, we need to get back up there now. These artifacts aren't worth innocent lives." "Wait," Hayes said, an idea forming in his mind. "Captain, is there any way to access the library area from down here? Some kind of passage that could get us close to where they're holding the hostages?" Whitmore paused, considering the question. "There's a service corridor that runs behind the library, but it's not a direct access. We'd still have to find a way to get through their defensive positions." Agent Rodriguez was monitoring multiple radio frequencies simultaneously. "Sir, I'm picking up chatter that suggests the intruders are getting frustrated. Their electronic equipment isn't finding what they expected to find, and they're starting to realize they might have been working with incomplete information." Hayes realized that this might be their opportunity. What if we gave them what they wanted? Both Whitmore and Rodriguez stared at him. "Sir, what if we offered to trade some of the artifacts for the hostages?" Not the most important pieces, but enough to make them think they're getting what they came for. Whitmore shook his head. Deputy Director, with all due respect, any artifact that leaves this chamber could end up being used to challenge legitimate property rights. We can't just hand over pieces of American history. Then what do you suggest, Captain? Because in 8 minutes, they're going to start killing innocent people. Whitmore was quiet for a moment, then his expression changed. Actually, sir, there might be another way. The chamber contains some very convincing reproductions that were made in the 1940s for research purposes. Documents that would pass casual inspection but wouldn't hold up to serious authentication. Hayes felt a spark of hope. You're talking about giving them fakes? I'm talking about giving them reproductions that will buy us time to mount a rescue operation. Once they have what they think they want, they'll be focused on getting out of here instead of maintaining tight security on the hostages. Agent Parker's voice crackled through their radios again. All units, we have movement in the courtyard. It looks like the intruders are preparing to leave, but they're loading equipment and personnel like they're planning to take the hostages with them. Hayes realized that the situation was about to get much worse. If the intruders succeeded in leaving the estate with the hostages, any chance of a successful rescue would disappear. Captain, how quickly can we get those reproductions? Up to the main floor? 5 minutes, sir. But we'll need to create a distraction to draw their attention away from the library long enough to get into position. Rodriguez had an idea. What if we used the estate's fire suppression system? If we could trigger the alarms and sprinklers in strategic locations, it might create enough confusion for us to move. Whitmore nodded with approval. The fire system can be controlled from the basement maintenance area. We could create a diversion in one part of the building while we approach the library from another direction. Hayes was already moving toward the chamber's exit. Let's do it. How many people do we need for this operation? All of us, sir. The Royal Guard members who are still free, your security team, and anyone else we can coordinate with. This is going to be a precision operation with no room for error. As they gathered the reproduction documents and prepared to leave the chamber, Hayes took one last look at the incredible collection that had been hidden beneath the estate for over 2 centuries. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming, not just for the safety of the hostages, but for preserving a piece of American heritage that most people didn't even know existed. They made their way through the basement corridors, moving with the kind of purposeful urgency that comes when lives are on the line. Whitmore led them to the maintenance area, where a complex panel controlled the estate's various systems. Agent Rodriguez, can you handle the fire suppression activation? Yes. Sir, just tell me when and where. Whitmore studied a blueprint of the estate's layout. We'll trigger alarms in the east wing and the 3rd floor simultaneously. That should draw their attention away from the library and give us a window to approach from the service corridor. Agent Parker's voice came through their radios with increasing urgency. All units, they're moving the hostages toward the main entrance. I repeat, the hostages are being moved. Hayes felt his heart racing. We're out of time. Execute the plan now. Rodriguez activated the fire suppression system, and immediately they could hear alarms blaring throughout the estate. The sound of sprinklers activating echoed through the corridors, and Hayes could imagine the confusion this would create among the intruders. Move, 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 Whitmore called out, leading them through the service corridor toward the library area. Behind them, other Royal Guard members emerged from various hiding places throughout the estate, all converging on the library with the coordination that spoke of extensive training and preparation. As they approached the library, Hayes could hear shouting and confusion from the intruders. The fire alarms had worked exactly as planned, creating enough distraction for the rescue team to get into position. Agent Rodriguez, are you ready with those reproduction documents? Ready, sir. Captain. Whitmore, are your people in position? In position and awaiting your signal, sir. Hayes took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether they succeeded in saving the hostages and protecting the artifacts, or whether everything they had worked for would be lost. On my count, Hayes said quietly. Into his radio. 3.do.1. Execute. What happened next would be talked about in government circles for years to come. The coordinated assault on the library was swift, precise, and absolutely decisive. The intruders, caught off guard by the fire alarms and confused by the sudden appearance of armed resistance from multiple directions, were overwhelmed before they could react effectively. When the dust settled 20 minutes later, all 12 hostages were safe, 37 intruders were in custody, and the priceless artifacts remained secure in their hidden chamber. Hayes stood in the courtyard of Pemberton Estate, watching as federal agents processed the crime scene and paramedics checked the hostages for injuries. Captain Whitmore approached him, no longer in his ceremonial uniform but wearing tactical gear that showed he was every bit the professional soldier Hayes had suspected him to be. "Sir," Whitmore said, extending his hand, "I owe you an apology. When this day started, I thought you were just another government official who didn't understand what we were protecting here." Hayes shook the captain's hand firmly. "And I thought you were just playing dress-up and getting in the way of important business. I guess we were both wrong?" "Not entirely wrong, sir. Just ... incomplete in our understanding." As Hayes watched the scene around him, he realized that the real treasure of Pemberton Estate wasn't the documents and artifacts hidden in the basement chamber. The real treasure was the dedication of people like Captain Whitmore and his team, who had spent their lives protecting something they believed was bigger than themselves. 6 months later, Hayes would return to Pemberton Estate for the formal ceremony recognizing the Royal Guard for their service. Captain Whitmore would receive a commendation from the Secretary of Defense, and the estate would be designated as a National Historic Site with permanent federal protection. But the story that would stay with Hayes for the rest of his career was simpler than all the official recognition and government ceremonies. It was the story of the moment when Captain Whitmore took one step